that we would be covering the display types as well as the positioning. And it can be really complex. And what I want to do is look at an example, and that's why I brought up Facebook. So one of the first things that I typically do in early stages, even before starting any development, is taking a moment and looking at the design, kind of dissecting the design. So say this was not a website, but this was like a mock-up or a concept. And even as you're developing the concept, you're thinking about how this could be coded and kind of put together. Now, ideally, you're using something like a UI library, component library, and building out individual pieces that make this and reusing it. But the idea of why you dissect it is to identify um, where there's reuse and the different patterns out there. So if you look at something like Facebook, there's this image and then some content on the right with some content under the left. Same thing here, but this is a text box that's inside here. The same thing exists here, same thing exists here, same thing exists here. So as you're going through it, what I like to do is print it off or take screenshots and identify it. So a lot of times I'll do something like this, actually highlight something and grab it and drop it into a sketch file. I have an example of one of these, and let's do this. I think I put it in here. No, I did not put it in there, but I think it was Move Easy. Yeah, but this Sketch is a design program. But basically, I just go into Sketch, I create an artboard, and I paste the different patterns that I see, and then try to create a collection. So I call that indexing my interface, or indexing the UI. And it's to identify where there's inconsistency in your design and trying to scale it back to find the reusable code patterns and how the content relates to it. So one of the most common patterns on the web, and you'll see it here, you'll see it here, you'll see it here, is what's called the media object. It's also the same thing that's widely used on all social media. So if I go to Twitter, I don't know why I say Twitter that way, you'll see the image off to the left and the content off to the right. And that pattern is very consistent. You see it on e-com sites or any product listing where there's content, an image on the right or left, and then the content either on the side of it. So that pattern it has its name. It's called the media object. So if we were to look at something like maybe just this right here, and let me take a screenshot of this. And there's other things underneath it, but we bring this up. Oops, I did this. I've gotten so used to the copy version of it as opposed to taking.
Well, you can do a screen grab and it just goes to the clipboard instead of your desktop.
Yeah. It's Command Shift 4 Control. Yeah. So I've gotten used to adding control in there. It's really awesome. That's a game changer.
Yeah.
But if you forget the control and you just go here, then it goes to your desktop. So this is like what we'll actually be building out and looking at the different ways of building this out. All right, so we have HTML, and let's just put this off to the left-hand side. So first we say, all right, we need to have an image. So starting off something like an image, I like to use Placehold It, and Placehold It is a website where you can come here and it gives you kind of a mock image. There's also Place Kitten. There's a bunch of different ones that are out there if you want real imagery. But this website's great, and I typically start with something here, and I say something like, all right, 50 by 50. And now we have the image here. And then I start talking about the other content here. So not really getting too much into like the DOM or what those headers will be, but I'm just going to put an H4, and I'm going to say the person's name. So this is Jordan. And then underneath that, I could decide, let's put a span, and this is going to be like date, time, info, and location. Okay, and then after there, put a paragraph, and it's going to have a block of text. And this is my primary content. So right here, I know I have an image, I have this and this, but this is just stacking it. And one of the good things about also doing this is if the CSS doesn't load, or if you remove the CSS from your design, the content and the interface should still make sense. So it should be prioritized. And there's maybe some times where you have to do some CSS manipulation because this is actually more relevant than that. So the name, the person's name or this location, and the image is not important. And this also gets into like the way that you think about responsive web design and mobile design is setting the priority of the content and then using CSS to change the structures. So that gets into like which of those choices to actually use. Am I going to have to use Flex or CSS grids are coming out now? Am I using display inline? Is it a block? Those types of decisions are going to, based off the priority of the content, you're going to make those decisions. All right, so here we have this plain div. And the nice thing about also like doing something like this, and I literally call out what they are because then I have a mental memory of what it is I'm going to be building out. A lot of like the designs and concepts are derived, or the UI that I'm building is derived from a concept if I don't have a UI toolkit already built out. So I don't want to be like so restricted by it because I want to focus on the content and the flow of the content. And when I'm designing out interfaces, I think of them from small screens to large screens and how they evolve and change. So we're going to put this in a div. So I just put that inside here. And looking at this, I kind of know what these are. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to put a class on this. And I was talking about the media object. And that's going to be where we start on this. I've brought this up before, so I like to do syntax highlighting, or syntax highlighting, name spacing. This is HTML. Let me put this over here. Where we have C as a namespace before, and it stands for component. There's O dash, and that stands for object. There is JS dash, and this is anything that's a selector, that's for JavaScript. There's an underscore dash, which is a hack, which may be due to a browser inconsistency or something that you know that you're prototyping. Sometimes like analytics packages that you're embedding. But you know like this guy is not going to be related to styling, and it's not necessarily going to be reused, but you need some kind of selector to overcome an issue. And then U dash, which stands for utility or helper. So when I'm writing my CSS selectors or classes, I'm using these to identify what type it is. So when I say something like O media, O stands for object, and media is going to be the media object. And we talked about kind of creating semantic but unsemantic names. So the idea is to create it as portable as possible and use object-oriented CSS where you're combining multiple classes, but identifying these classes or the selectors to have names that make sense for your development team that people can understand. Avoiding things like a semantic name like, being like U-red, where maybe the color turns red, or is it the background color turns red? I don't know. So then someone's like U-red-BG. But then say that red color actually turns to green. Now I have a selector that is identified as red, but it's actually outputting green. And so you want to avoid those types of things. So media, inside here what we're going to do is we're going to have double underscore asset. Oh, wait, I'm not going to write this in Sass, sorry. I'm so used to writing Sass. All right, so we're going to have double underscore asset, and this is BAM. So in BAM, the relationship is children to parent, and how you identify your selectors is saying asset is a part of OMedia. So this selector is going to be applied to something that lives inside of OMedia. It is contextually dependent on its parent, meaning that OMedia double underscore asset can't live outside of OMedia. I could have another series of OMedias inside of this, but it starts that loop over again. So it's just identifying and making a relationship between the CSS that you're writing and the actual DOM structures that exist in the code. So a lot of times, if you're not following a methodology like BEM, you may have a bunch of CSS code that you're like, what does that actually do? And you have a bunch of DOM with a bunch of classes, and you're like, which one can, if I remove this, is it going to break the interface? So it's to say that this is going to be a structure, and this object is going to have interior parts that are all kind of working together. And components are another really good use of it. It's usually in objects and components that you're using BEM, but utilities can also be used. The last piece of BEM is the double dash, which is a helper or a modified version of it. So this would be like a variant, and I could apply that at this. So this is the block, this is the element, and this is the modifier. That's what BEM stands for. And we'll continue talking about that. I just want to bring that up. So also inside there, we're going to have another structure that's called main. And I've seen this be called main or body. So inside here, we have our asset. So I'm just going to put this on O media. And sometimes what I actually like to do, as opposed to putting a class on an image, is to put a wrapper around it, because it allows it to be a little bit more flexible, because then I could have some restrictions on the image. Because if I'm using like a JPEG, even though this structure is really flexible, I could put restrictions on the asset itself if it's like a 50 by 50, so it doesn't scale up to be 100 pixels. So there's some benefits of doing it, and I'm not really afraid to add wrappers around stuff, and it also increases legibility in certain cases. So have O media main, and this is where all of our content's going to live. Now this is still going to look one for one, even though I've added, additional wrappers, so it still renders the exact same way. Inside here, I'm going to do one quick thing. I'm just going to, this won't change too much of anything, but we had discussed this as box sizing, border box. So just stabilizing that. And I'm going to do one thing here. I'm just going to get rid of the margin on the body. All right, so these are our selectors, and here's our DOM structure over here. This is stuff that we've kind of covered, the classes, and we're following BEM. So main is a part of media, and assets a part of it. Sometimes I even create classes in association. If there's down the road, I may need to add styling to it. So even though maybe like _main doesn't do anything, it's still there. All right, so when looking at CSS, a div is a block. So if I were to highlight this and do inspect and highlight this div, this O media, if I look at the computed, right here, the user agent says block, and then the other way of looking at this is display and seeing where it's come from. It's important to know that there's different ways of setting this up. I'm taking a break away from the O media right now just to show you the difference between these. So there's display block, which is by default. If you have something that's a display block, so say O media is always going to exist on a div, then I don't need to define it as a block. And I try to avoid using things like displays inside of a reusable piece of code and creating it more of as a utility. And as you dabble with more of the ways to structure, it becomes really important, because like flex works from the parent to child, and if I'm adding a display type to one of the children, it doesn't inherit the flex properties. So that's why I like to suggest making these more of like a helper as opposed to on an object or a reusable piece. But anyways, here's inline block. This is a very common one, and what this does is it treats this as a block of code that I can still add styles to, similar to a block type. So block types allow me to identify a height, a min width, and add padding to it. So this may not look that different, and the biggest difference is if I put this outline here and say red, it stops right here. And if this goes to its default user agent, which is a block, it goes to the full edge. So display block will go from one edge to another of the parent inside of it. Now there's what's referred to as inline. So inline is primarily reserved for text treatments. but you can also use it in interface design, and you get this really interesting treatment of where it's looking at this as one inline piece. So if I had a paragraph here, just to kind of show you a really quick example, and say we have around 30, and we're going to put a span here. So we have this P, which is paragraph, and I'm just going to outline it with 1 pixel blue, so you can see it at the top here. Now, by default, a paragraph is also a display block. If I say display inline block, it's still going to render the exact same in this case because it goes past the full width, so it's not going to like randomly stop it somewhere. But if I say display, oops, let me keep that as is. If I say P and say directly inside of it, span, right now the span has a default inline because spans, B tags, I tags, EM tags, so there's I for italic, EM is the same thing as italic, B is bold, there's also strong. These are all inline default. Like by default, their display types are inline. Now, if I were to just change the span to a color blue, you'll see it be blue right there. Now, if I try to add padding to it, say it's 50 pixels. So it adds on the left and right, but it doesn't add it to the top. Now, if I try to do something like min height of 200 pixels, it doesn't do anything because it's inline. Now, I'm going to comment that out. If I said display inline block, if you watch what happens as this saves, nothing changes. But now, if I go back and add padding, it now works all around it. So it inherits both some of the block styling and inline capabilities, and it can add something like a height to it now. So now it's a minimum of 200 pixels. So there's a lot of things with that. Those are the primary ones that you'd use. There's display static. And I don't know which from out of the box uses static, but static is another one. It's kind of like a rewrite or a set. Now, the one that I'm going to avoid right now is Flex, because Flex is its own conversation. Flex is now pretty stable, and people are using it for interface design, but we'll put a pause on Flex for right now. All right, so this guy, I'm going to remove this inline. So those are the main display types. There's inline, inline block, and block. But pay attention to the user agent and try to avoid them maybe in an object or a component and use them as helper classes. And that'll make more sense as we talk about things like Flex. All right, so I'm going to get rid of this paragraph tag, and we have this oMedia. Now, one of the things that people would do is remember this image off to the side, and I want this content to be there. There's many ways that I could do this. One of the ways I can is say float left. So now this image is right here and this content's right here. But this is one of those things that gets really confusing. If I say like background color blue on here, let me get rid of this. And I'm actually going to get rid of this paragraph for the time being and simplify this. So it's just the person's name, and I'm going to also get rid of this. All right, so right now this is a background color blue, and it goes from top to bottom. Now if I did something like asset float left, you see how this blue doesn't go all the way to the bottom? And the reason why that doesn't happen is floats have this way that they render, and it makes sense, but there's some complexity with it. That it is taking that image and kind of making it treated inline, and it removes some of the height pieces associated with it. So position absolute is another one that doesn't look at height, and there's different ways of overcoming this, and I'll show you how to do that. But right here, if I just said float left, you can see the blue doesn't go all the way to the bottom, and this becomes a very common issue with people misusing or using float. Same thing happens is if I were to add float right on main, I guess this one won't happen because this is actually shorter than that image, so it's just floating off to the right. So that's a bad example. But what I want to do is overcome what this piece does. So we have float left and we have the content here. The common setup for this is to say O media and using a pseudo class, and then we say after, and I create content, and I say display table, which I skipped over this one because this is another example which will happen in the flag object. So here we have display table. Right now this has created a pseudo class, so if I put like XXX, you'll see XXX showing up right here. And I just want this to be blank. And I say clear, oops, I say clear both. Now this has cleared my float, so this is saying at the end of my content, I want to make sure that that float isn't having the rendering issues that that a float has. So it says afterwards, like, treat this as a block that's all consistent, and we're just using the float to move that image off to the left. So now, right now, we have this person's name. Let me add some more lorem ipsum here so it gets really long. And you can see that this content's starting to flow here. Let's add more, 50. 2 minutes. Yeah. So here we have this title and we have this image, and I've added more content, and the content's actually bigger than the image itself. Now this is starting to look like the design, but you can see right here, this content, if this was longer, you would imagine that the content would go off to the right. Like when we were looking at things like Twitter, Twitter is probably a better example than this one right now. If we look at Twitter, how this goes here and the content's not wrapping around, we want to avoid that. So how we can do that, there's multiple ways, and this is what makes the media object really awesome. So now we've cleared the float for the left, and it could also be a right and does the exact same thing. What I want to do is say overflow hidden. On this guy. Come on. Overflow hidden here keeps it inside the bounds. So now as I add more content inside here, this is consistently wrapping down, and this image is going to stay off to the left. One of the other things I'm going to do here, just to do a reset on this, is H4. I'm going to say margin top 0, margin top bottom 0. So why that spacing was happening was from the user agent. So I'm just kind of clearing that out. And I'm going to move this down here. Again, we talked about this the other day. You want to kind of organize your code, but things that are more specific and have higher specificity, put them at the end of it. So that's why this one's here. But there would probably, in the use case for this, I would have a reset on the actual object. All right, so where this gets really awesome is we see this 50 by 50 pixel and we have all this content. But if I increase this to 150, what happens is the image grows and the content gets pushed off to the left. So this becomes one of those most common interface pieces of designing. And this same thing is used across multiple sites. And it's not necessarily just an image to content. It could be anything that has a width or a restriction, and you want to start creating a column. So this is also a way that you could set up navigation, left-hand navigation, main body content. And this is why I like to bring this up as like the first step of like talking about structuring and positioning in CSS, because it hits on the display types where you don't need to actually define a display type, and it uses float, but then it clears a float, and then it also gives you this nice structure inside here. And because of this, you can use it on images, you can use it on whatever, and then we can make some cool stuff. So now if we get rid of this and we go back to the initial setup, content's right there, and let's go back to 50, 50, and we put the span inside here. We have the title and location, and then all I need to do for that last block is put the paragraph after this. Oops. Let's do this. You don't need to be sorry.
Have a good one.
All right. See ya. Yeah. I'll post this video too. All right, see ya. All right, so now we have this news item or whatever we want to call it. And I'm going to get rid of this. And this one. So now we have that image off to the side. We have the content here, and then we have the main content underneath of it. So what I did here was I just moved the media object inside here and added a paragraph afterwards. And in the case of this, because these guys are inside here, what I'll do is this. So now we have that wrapping effect and that image up there and the content underneath. Now, because I hate serif fonts, and I don't want to look at that for any longer. So the other thing that
I'm sorry, did you change the background to be something other than blue?
Yes.
Really,
oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Yeah. That's an awful choice for me. There's certain colors that I start doing. Oh, this is also really bad. Let's do. Let me just change that image color. All right, cool. Is that better?
Sure.
So this guy is kind of the base setup of Facebook and the media object. Now there's certain things like spacing in between. So I could create a utility class, I like to say use space, and I go like top, right, left. But I like to do numbers on it. So this would be like a padding top of maybe my default unit. So inside my interface, I define a unit as my default and make variations off of it. So I may have a use space 1 dash small, which is maybe half the size of my default. But I create use space 1, I create 2, which is right, I create 3, which is bottom, I create 4, which is left.
So why would you, I know you had that semantic things, but why would you use 1, 2, 3, 4 when you could use, are there more than
that's just my pattern. I could do top, right.
Okay.
It's primarily, that's just the way, because how CSS renders, it literally goes top, right, bottom, left.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I number it that way.
Gotcha.
There's what's referred to as like CSS comb. So people that are really anal about writing like their code follow the properties in a certain order.
Right.
And to me, there's just certain ones I'm like, space actually really matters to me.
Yeah,
and like blocking different sections of CSS code together. So it's just one of those things I do. There's no rhyme or reason for it, and that's just semantics. So I'd like to separate out different properties, like almost options for my CSS by using the double pipe. So CSS, even though I'm using this double pipe, this is actually being read as a special character that would have to escape, but I use this as a way to organize my code. So here, if I said pipe, and I said use space 4, what this is going to do is put a space right next to it. And because I piped this here, I know that this is an option. So I could get rid of this, or if there was also other additional things that were optional, I could get rid of them. Another thing that I also do is if it's more of a component, like in they're required, like say these two were always supposed to be together, I'll put 2 stars around it and say everything inside there you can't delete. If you change it, you're going to break the interface. So then if it was something like, all right, this is required, but then this is optional, I would know that I can get rid of this. And this is, but I would have typically something else like in here and like whatever. These are inside here. And if I were to remove this, the interface would break. So those are just like ways that I've been organizing code and especially creating reusable pieces. Because a lot of times I'm taking things like the media object and just adding additional properties, which even things like anchors and call to actions and buttons. I may have 20 different buttons, but the only difference is 1 or 2 additional helper classes, like my big button versus my small button. All right, so here we have the space here. This is one approach of doing spacing. I've also seen people just by default saying, because of our interface, we know that we always want 20 pixels off to the left-hand side. So they define that inside of here. So they say main has a padding left. So I could easily add padding left of 20 here, and I get the same effect. Other people may also do something like treat it as a namespace and say spaced, or add something like default and say, all right, inside here, we're going to say omedia main directly inside of it gets a padding left of 40 pixels. Oops. Yeah. So this would also be another way of doing it if I actually added this helper class there. And that overrides the other value because of specificity, and this one has higher specificity. So that's a nice way of doing it, kind of putting like options out there and inheriting it down, namespacing it. It keeps code kind of clean and allows you to do like one option and get like a really nice thing, or to create something like that's called like default. And by adding default in here, you're kind of treating it more of like a theme. Actually, in the case of doing styles, you want to do T, which that was the last one that I missed out of, because I wasn't thinking that T dash is theme, so styles. So I could say something like O media, T media, and I could maybe have variations on it, and it could be like background color is white, and then all my anchors in here are, oops. Anchors are color navy, and then if I actually put this as an anchor, you'll see this go to an anchor. And then these would be kind of optional pieces. And something like themes would go at the end of your style sheet. Even though that they may not have higher specificity, but in inheritance in the way the CSS reads from top to bottom, these are like the last things that you want to override. And if you're getting specificity, this is a good spot to kind of battle with it. Harry Roberts, or CSS Wizardry, his approach has been for themes and utilities to actually end them with important. And he makes a case, or he wrote an article about this, that if it's a utility, you know it's like a sledgehammer. So then that's why it's an okay use of important. But in my mind, the only time to use important is to override the inline style attribute. All right, so you can see like I added that theme in there, and that's why that's navy. And we have the space off to the left. Oops. That is from here. So it kind of gives you like, you know, some options inside here. You could also say something like spaced. Oops. Let's namespace how we're dealing with our headers. So I could say like H1, H2, H3, H4, H5. Even though these aren't in my interface, it's just being prepared that other header types may be in there. And I could say padding bottom 10 pixels. You know, so I can start creating like some basic rules and stylings to it. And there's, again, millions of different ways of doing this. But why, again, this is so important and like powerful as a, I guess, an architecture for CSS is this can be applied to many things. I can change the image size. I can add a bunch of content here, and it's going to be free-flowing. And if my browser gets smaller, it's also kind of built in to be responsive. If I'm injecting this or using this DOM structure in another container, then I can easily have it. So I think right now, I know I went through this really quickly, and I think this is a good, we can continue covering this in the next session and going into more of the display types, the floating, the positioning, and this becomes like the core of starting the structure. So the next session, I think covering how I could build out the media object in another format would be really good. I could show you it in about 5 minutes if you want to see that now, or...
I mean, yeah. I mean, I could stay for a little while.
Okay.
I'm not rushed if you want to.
Yeah. So let me show you one other example of how this exact thing could be built out and kind of the benefits of it. So we have news item. We're going to create another news item. And I'm just going to change this from O media to O flag. And this is going to be really interesting to look at. They're going to be one for one, but there's going to be some slight variations and actually less selectors needed. So we have, reviewing this, the floating on the left, and the treatment of this overflow hidden so it doesn't wrap this way. And for the flag, I'm going to do a similar approach. And I'll start with the name, but we're going to go back and refactor this because I want to keep this as one for one as possible from a DOM standpoint. So for this guy, you can see that the content's floating down there, and this is just the base way that the HTML is rendering, right? I'm going to do a display table. And because I'm doing display table, I need to apply table cell to these to the children inside it. And I'm going to show you what a table looks like in base HTML. Oops, table cell. So now these kind of render next to each other. So in CSS, there's what's referred to as a table, and there's a lot of actual DOM structure to it, but not getting too much into it. I'm just going to do a table, and I'm going to do a TR, which is a table row, and then a TD, which is a, I don't know what the D stands for right now, but this is a cell, and then this is a cell. And if I had more rows, I have this guy and this guy. So this is base HTML, and this is before some of the structure pieces that came out. This is how you would design. You would use tables, and there's some properties associated with it. And with this, it expands based off the content. So if this was longer, this creates this grid of this is one cell, and it's looking at it as like columns and rows. And like this one is related to this one because it's in that first cell position. Similar to if you open up an Excel, you can't make your row 2 be less wide than row 1. So it's just thinking of in columns and rows. And that's how tables work out of the box. But you can apply the same treatment as tables to things that aren't the table element. So that's what we're going to do here. And if you were to look at these properties associated with this, it's table cell from the user agent. And even though it's a table cell, like anything else, I could always say just like inline block and override that, and then it becomes a traditional HTML element. Same thing here, and same thing here. And you'll notice that Chrome actually injected the proper structure for it, so that there are some like requirements. It just reads it that way. So if I do display block here, now this is rendering more like how HTML and how you would imagine it. But that is not what we're doing here. Let me refresh this. All right, so the second guy here is similar, but you'll notice that this is at the bottom. So the cool thing about the table is it has alignment. As opposed to float, I can't control the vertical alignment of the text very easily. So I'm going to create a couple utility helpers here, and I'm going to say just VA top. So utility vertical align top. And then I'm going to create one that's for middle. And then bottom. And there's also baseline. I won't, I might as well. All right. So with this, this guy's being pushed down to the bottom and it's just rendering the default way. If I add this here, it will move to the top. If I said middle, it will go into the middle right there. So that's like really nice. And you could also define that on its own. Now, if I make this 150, you'll see that this grows to 150, similar to how we had it before. If I had space here, same thing can be applied. So it's 1 for 1. Now, the beauty of this one is I could add an asset at the end of this and render the same way. So the image just goes there. Now, one of the gotchas with using table is it doesn't expand the full width. It renders similar to like inline block. So you would imagine that maybe this table would fulfill the full width. So for me to actually make this be the full width, I would have to add some kind of helper class. So I'm just going to say 100%. And let's add that here. So now it's going to be the full width, oops, the full width of the container. Come on. And then we have this image here and this one here, right? Again, the beauty of this is I can add multiples of these. I can move them around. I can change the vertical height and top. Now, one thing I don't need is these to be called asset or main. They can be all called item. Because the property inside there is just one CSS property that's being shared between two of them. So if I look at this, the only difference between it is their names. So what I could do is call it item. And then we get the same treatment. Now where this gets really cool is like O flag space. We could say flag item inside it gets a space of whatever inside. Let's get rid of this really quick. So, why is that guy not getting it? Oh. So this is another weird thing. Remember how I was talking about the widths inside? I can't add a padding on an image. I can do a margin because the padding would be on the inside of the image, if you think about that. So I'm just going to add this wrapper here and put the image inside of it. Same thing on this guy. And then I need to get rid of this guy. Cool. And I don't want to call it asset, I just want to call it item. So now this is going to say item plus item, or is going to be spaced in between them. So it allows for more flexibility. It's a really nice structure, and one of the the bad thing about this is, unlike the media object, where if I add another line to it, it doesn't have to keep the same width as my column. So this starts creating that grid row column inside that container, which may not be the right option for the right content. So this gets into like, do I use the flag? Do I use the media object? They have relatively the same output. The flag has some additional options from vertical alignment and some flexibility with that. But then the media object allows me to be a little bit more creative with the content that I'm putting in it. But end of day, they could both work the same way in spacing wise. So this is the table setup of it. This is a traditional float, and floats are moving. You can do left and right, and it's just one of the base ways of coming up with structure. And these both allow me to be really flexible on creating a reusable piece of code that I can use on multiple projects. And then let's do something like this to kind of space these guys out. Okay. And let's be fun. Back. Okay. And let's go back to this news item. And I would probably want to change this from media to like something else because I'm using it on the flag and the media. But you can see that they're both like utilizing that same style. So if I change this to red, they both get red.
Wait, so can we go really quick?
Yeah.
You did with use space just now.
Mm-hmm.
You made a use space selector with nothing in it.
Yeah.
And then you added use space to the other.
Yeah, I was originally going to write that in Sass, so and then I stopped myself. So if I was using Sass, I could just say add extend dot u space one, oops, and it would do. Oh man, it would output the same way that I wrote it. So I was just manually writing it.
So, but then can you explain? So you didn't do that.
Yeah. So with use space here, if I look at this and inspect this guy, we have O media, right? And then inside O media, or above the parent wrapper for it, has news item. News item right now isn't doing anything, but then on these guys, or do we not have any styles on news item? Doesn't really matter right now. But use space right here, you can see that this selector is sharing that property. So in CSS, you want to try to, if you can group things together that are CSS properties, you want to do something like this. And the method that or the directive I was going to initially use is a Sass directive, which is add extend, which would render my CSS and compile it this way. And this is a good way of doing it. But where people go wrong with add extend and also like sharing CSS properties, I like to do them by groups or sections. Like so, something like spacing. If I have a bunch of different CSS selectors or that are associated with spacing, I want to share those properties with similar type. Now I wouldn't want to, initially we had like the O flag main, like the left padding there, or the O space. Even though that's using space, it may be in a different section of my CSS, and you kind of have to go hunt for it. If I was sharing the padding left from that inherited, and it was like right here, comma, O flag or O media dash double dash space, a developer coming into this later on would never realize it. So in the case of this, like I have use space 4, 3, 2, 1, and use space is inheriting all those properties. So, and then that becomes really nice if we want to change these to like 10 across the board. Then I don't have to update it in 2 places. And then, so there's news item, which we'll give it something that makes it stand out. I thought I had that. Can't type today. God. Yep. I was just testing you. You win. And looks like I forgot that I was highlighting something earlier. Cool. So now these guys are here. I'm going to create just something called like O container, which will just have a max width. And in addition to that, I'm going to create I'll just call it sections. So this is now all of a sudden growing really quick. Let's close out this guy. Let's indent this guy here. Cool. Looking good. And remember how I was talking about the stars earlier? So I want these guys to be associated with each other. And if this is my layout that I want to keep them this way. But I'm going to do something like this and say, oh, sections, double underscore, section. So now I have two items inside here that are inside sections, and they're both this news item done two different ways. And then there's this section grouping. So this becomes kind of its block. And why this div is really nice is I'm going to space these two out in between, but then this becomes its own thing, but these are individual components. So it's like a component inside of a component inside of a wrapper. And I'll explain that after I finish writing this. And you know, I talked about this, like having blank CSS selectors inside here, because you may try to do a search for like a find O-sections with the curly bracket, and you may not find it. So that's why sometimes I just keep it in there. So if you are looking for it, then right immediately afterwards you have the code. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I just do that. Actually, I'm gonna do a margin. Okay, and then I'm going to do one last thing here, and then I'll walk you through this. Just do something that'll be really noticeable. Cool. And let's do... I'm going to do one thing that I meant to do earlier that I forgot to do. Actually, yeah. I don't like where I'm going to put this, but there's a better way that we could have done this if I would have done that other example differently. But so this is just spacing out that guy down at the bottom. All right, so what I have here is these individual pieces done two different ways. Content is flexible. You know, and I would go back and kind of clean this up and align to it, but that's basically the Facebook object right there. And you could do some tweaks on it, additional styling. With this, I have this container, which is giving my max width. So there's margin right and margin left. And that's one of those CSS tricks that exists, that as it looks, you define a width in it. And so max width says you don't expand past 800 pixels. Now I could define it as a width of 800, but then that runs into issues as my browser gets smaller. So for example, I make my browser smaller, it still continues to work. And the reason why that works is it's saying it's a max width of 800. Once I reach 800, it doesn't grow past that. So that's just a really nice way of kind of separating that out for you. And then the margin left, right, you know, margin is how you do gutters in one of the unit spacings, but auto treats it as there's space over here and space over here, so we're going to calculate this to even it out, and we're going to center you on the page. So that's actually the proper way of centering if you're not using something like a display inline text align center, which is weird, or using flex and some of the different ways of justifying the content. So there's a container, and then we have a space around it, which gives us this padding on the sides. And then we have O sections, which is saying that there's going to be sections inside this container, and then identifying each of those sections. So section lives inside of sections. meaning that I could get rid of one of these, I could add another one, and it can repeat, but I'm going to have the same pattern and spacing associated with them. So it becomes this really nice thing. I may only have one inside of a section, but still operates and works the same way because the spacing is saying if two sections are next to each other, add some margin at the top to space them out to render this way. Each of these sections are its own news item. You could potentially put this in its own wrapper inside to kind of break down the components. So we look at this, we have news item, which is also a section, which is part of section. So section becomes a reusable pattern of the interface. So there's multiple sections inside of section, but each of those sections contain a C news item, which has its own specific component styling, which is this background color and the border. And then inside of it, it has the content, and we're utilizing both the media object and the flag object to say we want this image off to the left with the title and this content. And if the content's longer, it's going to wrap and still keep that structure on top of it. So we have multiple patterns inside here. Like the media object is its own pattern. If I had some kind of treatment for the H4, like a title, like an article title, that would be its own kind of individual component that exists. And even the image size, putting restrictions on that, becomes its own component. But looking at this, there's really three main things that are going on. There's this news item that's inside of a section, and that section is just about the spacing. And that's contained inside of its own section, which is part of this global thing. So it's multiple repeatable patterns inside here. And as we look at this and start building out more interface items, you need to start thinking about how this is its own component, which is part of a bigger component. So do you have any questions about that? I know I covered that super fast.
I don't have any specific ones right now. I mean, I think seeing it all come together makes sense. Like when it was seeing how you first started with just the basic things and expand it. And then I think if I actually went through what you just wrote, the code, kind of place where everything is happening, and slightly slower pace.
Yes, sorry.
No, I mean it's kind of incredible, how quickly you can do this and make sense. I mean, I understand the hierarchies of build, I think.
Well, and people see things like a Facebook interface item like this, and they think this is really difficult to build out. But a lot of times you're just overthinking what it is. And if you take that moment to dissect what you're actually doing, you realize this is not a complex thing. And this is not an 8-hour thing for me to turn around. This is something I could whip out in 30 seconds.
Yeah.
And and that's where people, my true hatred for these frameworks like Bootstrap is they're trying to identify an easy way for you to make an interface item like this by overcomplicating it. And anything in Bootstrap or Foundation, if you know what you're doing, and even we're in our third or fourth session here, with the knowledge that you've had and the hours that you put into it, which it's still a fair amount of numbers, but it's kind of limited or minimal.
Right.
With that knowledge, you could start building out things that are in Bootstrap quicker than it is to learn Bootstrap. And I say anything that's in Bootstrap, if you know what you're doing, you can recreate it in a couple seconds. And it's really true. And people think I'm crazy for saying things like this. But even complex navigational items like mobile navs, those toggles, from the desktop to a hamburger menu, people always overthink it.
Well, and so in the tutorial that you share, he kind of does that in a pretty basic way by having just the menu width, and then it becomes just an inline, right? And that's a simple way to do it, but it shows that adding some responsiveness can take just a line or two to make it happen, which is interesting.
And it's funny, this out of the box is set literally for responsive web design.
Right.
And it's just a proper way of writing code. And if you're writing your interface in a way to think about how it can scale, because if I just put width on here, I meant to show this. So if I change this to width, desktop it looks the same, but do you see how the content flows out?
Right.
And it's like those minor things about thinking about the content in the different contexts and how you want it to be flexible to meet the needs of the various ways that people may be interacting with the content. And it's really the change of one CSS property.
Right. Yeah.
So cool. I think that's it for today. And we'll kind of continue to grow on this example or additional one. So we'll be covering flex in the next one, and then getting into the positioning of relative, fixed, and absolute. So those can be really, they can be misused a lot. And by walking you through some of like the common misuses of it, we'll highlight how to actually do it properly. And especially you as a designer, be thinking about how to reposition content and prioritize it that makes sense in the actual restrictions that you have inside of the browser window. So there's some cool things that you can do. And
so we didn't do any of that today. You just positioned things by making blocks.
Yeah. Well, I didn't even change a single. The only display type I used was in the flag object, and that's using the display table. So that's the only use of a display that I used. In the case that the media object, it's not utilizing any of the display types at all. It's just using float.
Right.
Now, so if the only thing that I do have to call out is if this was, so this is the media object version of it. If I change this to a span, we're going to run into some issues. And span, remember I said by default is an inline. So if I look at this and I say, why is that doing that? It's like, oh, it's a span. Well, by default, this is a display inline. And the display inline, remember, doesn't have those restrictions on width and the vertical side. So I would need to add something to the span. I could either do something like high specificity and say, okay, if it's an O media, span O media, give it a display inline block or block, but I'm going to say inline block. Now it's fixed. But in the case of this, I wouldn't recommend doing that. I would create more utility helpers because I go nuts on utility helpers, and I would say something like, let's create U display block. I typically call it udis because I like how that sounds. It sounds funny, like udis block or udis b. Yeah. I do that, but some of my friends that I work with don't really. Yeah, they don't get it. But there's really not much to get there. But I like to, when I start projects, I have a lot of these already kind of set up. And I actually typically call them like IB for like inline block. And you'll actually see this in some of the frameworks that exist, the ones even that I criticize. And having some of these utility helpers from the beginning of a project, these become portable to any project, like spacing, display inline blocks, and then you start getting used to writing your code the same way and really utilizing it. So let's go here and let's say, and I'm not putting a pipe here because if it's a span and it's this media main, this is actually a requirement for this to render. And that's fixed it. So that's the only thing we're really talking about displays. And right now, we're not doing positioning. And you'll see people try to do something like this in positioning formats. As I said, there's thousands of ways of doing this. But there's some correct ways of doing it. And the correct ways are based around the content that you have, as well as the flexibility to scale it and reuse it across your interface. And each interface is always kind of unique, and that's why taking the time to dissect the design when you're coming up with concepts, find those reusable pieces. So someone could position this absolute and then add padding and break it off. And I see that all the time. Even some really complex frameworks that are relatively architected in a decent way, like SAP UI 5 is an enterprise interface framework, and they do some really cool stuff from an architectural side, but they do really bad decisions when it comes to things like the media object. They overthink it. So they make some really awesome decisions for some base things, but then when it comes to structural, they make some of the worst decisions I've seen. So there's that. Cool. Well, I forgot that I'm recording this last bit of this. So I'll post this video online, and then if you have any additional questions about this, definitely don't hesitate. But I think playing with this code pen and kind of maybe even rewatching this, you'll be able to make it click if it's not already.